Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. My life changed when the new Homeowners Association, HOA, took control of our neighborhood. They were very pushy and wanted everyone to follow their rules 100%, even if you hadn't signed up to join the HOA. Every time one of my neighbors received a letter from the HOA, they knew their day was ruined. These letters were filled with orders. I don't understand why anyone would voluntarily join an organization that imposes more obligations and drawbacks than benefits. I wasn't a member of this HOA, but I always knew that one day they might come up with something and approach me as if I were a member, trying to order me around. And that's exactly what happened when they suddenly realized that I was the only one in the neighborhood with my own pond. Thinking it would be beneficial for them to gain jurisdiction over me, I voluntarily refused to sign any papers, even ignoring the benefits of joining the HOA, which they talked to me about for about 30 minutes. In reality, all their benefits create problems and then offer solutions. For example, for some unknown reason, the company that previously handled trash removal in our area stopped servicing our locality, and suddenly the HOA appeared and immediately resolved this issue. However, it costs 3 times more if you're not part of their community, and even if you are a member, it will cost at least 1.5 times more than it did before. But that's a story for another time. Back to the main issue. The HOA set their sights on my pond, which was quite large, and wanted my private beach to become a public one. I refused immediately, but they didn't care about me or my private property. They entered my private land without my permission and began patrolling the area around my pond. The official reason was unauthorized activity near my pond. Later, they claimed they had expanded the activities of HOA officers to ensure compliance with the new rules. I called the police and they helped me for a while. But then these HOA officers returned. This time, they came onto land that was entirely covered with surveillance cameras. I documented each time they trespassed on my private property without my permission. The outcome didn't take long. I filed a lawsuit against them. They quickly conceded in court because I had 100% evidence against them. We agreed on a substantial compensation amount and that they would forget my name and where my land was located. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. A few years back, I was in a job that I truly loved, working with a team that just clicked on every level. There were 5 of us, each handling different aspects of the same projects. I couldn't ask for better coworkers. They were all experts at what they did, and it felt like we were a well-oiled machine tackling challenges together. I'd often find myself looking forward to Monday, excited to jump back into work. It was almost like solving a set of complex logic puzzles every day. Yeah, I know I sound like a nerd, but trust me, I did have a life outside of work too. But like with everything, there was a catch. His name was Steve. Now, Steve wasn't my boss or anyone directly in charge of our team, but he was pretty high up the food chain, about 3 levels above us. He'd been around for a long time and had strong connections with the upper management. The problem with Steve? He was notorious for being a creep. He had a habit of making wildly inappropriate comments to the women in the office, and there were rumors about him being a bit too handsy. No one had proof of anything beyond that, but the whisper network was loud and clear. Stay away from Steve. The first week I started, multiple people pulled me aside and gave me the same advice. Never be alone with him. It was one of those unspoken truths. Everyone knew, but no one had the guts to go up against someone with his clout. Documenting inappropriate behavior isn't easy, and nobody wanted to gamble their career on taking down someone like Steve. For the first couple of years, I did exactly what I was told. I kept my distance. Steve occasionally made me uncomfortable with a stray comment, but I brushed it off and stayed out of his way. Then things changed. One evening, during our team's usual happy hour, Rob, one of my teammates, let something slip that stopped us all in our tracks. Rob is one of the most solid guys I know. He's on the quieter side, non-neurotypical with some subtle tics, but he's brilliant at his job. He's also one of those people who get nervous in social situations, especially if things become uncomfortable. So, over drinks, Rob casually mentions that Steve's been picking on him. At first, we didn't fully understand the gravity of it, but we quickly got him to explain. And the more Rob shared, the more enraged we all became. Apparently, Steve had been targeting Rob for weeks, mocking his tics and questioning his ability to do his job. He went as far as calling him a on one occasion. Steve, who normally had no reason to interact with anyone on our team except when he was being creepy, was going out of his way to bully Rob. And it was working. Rob was a wreck. He'd been losing sleep, his anxiety was through the roof, and it was taking a toll on his health. The irony? Rob was a superstar at his job, far better than most people I'd worked with, including Steve. Hearing this, I could feel myself seething with anger. And I wasn't the only one. We all immediately started telling Rob he needed to go to HR. Given his neurological condition, Steve's behavior was a clear violation of workplace laws. But Rob was terrified. He begged us not to say anything and said he regretted bringing it up. He didn't want the attention, didn't want to escalate things. We reluctantly agreed to keep quiet if that's what he wanted. But I left the bar that night with my blood boiling. I couldn't sit back and let Steve get away with it anymore. Rob may have been too anxious to go to HR, but that didn't mean I had to sit idly by. I decided to start my own investigation and document everything Steve did. But first, I needed to get him to engage with me. I wasn't going to just wait around for something to happen. I needed to be proactive. Instead of avoiding Steve, I began to subtly engage him. I sent him a professional message through our company's chat system, asking a work-related question about a client. Sure enough, he took the bait. Steve began replying with highly inappropriate messages, filled with personal innuendos. At first, I didn't respond much, but when I did, I pretended to be oblivious to his comments, replying in a very literal way or pretending not to understand what he meant. Every now and then, I'd call him out directly by saying something like, "This isn't appropriate," or "Please don't talk to me like that, Steve." But he didn't care. He kept pushing, crossing every line imaginable. It wasn't just online either. In the office, he'd say the most bizarre and disgusting things to me, comments that were so inappropriate they almost didn't make sense. I remember one instance where he looked at me and said, "Is it legal to have an ass like that in that skirt?" I was left wondering if he even heard the words coming out of his mouth. Each time something happened, I made a point of writing it down. Every gross comment, every inappropriate remark, the time, the date, and anyone who might have witnessed it. I also saved every inappropriate chat message. By the time I was ready to go to HR, I had a solid paper trail. After about a month of gathering evidence, I marched into HR and asked to file a formal complaint against Steve for his inappropriate conduct. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, the HR team kicked into high gear. They pulled in the head of HR and a few other senior reps to review my evidence. They took everything I had, the chat logs, my notes, and asked a ton of questions. They assured me they'd take it seriously and asked if I knew of anyone else who had experienced similar issues with Steve. I gave them the names of several other women in the office who had confided in me over the years. Finally, after years of putting up with his behavior, it felt like something was being done. They sent me out of the HR office, promising to investigate further. I was hopeful, but the waiting period was tough. 2 weeks passed before I got a formal update. When I finally heard back, I could hardly believe it. Steve had been let go. The relief in the office was palpable. People were celebrating in small, subtle ways, but the mood had shifted dramatically. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and there was this unspoken sense of unity that we had won something together, even though not everyone knew exactly what had happened. The most satisfying part for me came as the details of the investigation started coming together. From what I learned over the next few months, the evidence I provided was only the tip of the iceberg. After I filed my complaint, HR began reaching out to the women whose names I had given them, as well as to some of the witnesses I had mentioned. Not surprisingly, many of them had their own stories about Steve. Encouraged by the investigation, a growing number of women began coming forward, sharing similar experiences of inappropriate behavior and misconduct. Some of their stories were even worse than mine. In fact, the worst case involved a junior staff member who had been assaulted by Steve at a company party the year before. She had been too scared to say anything at the time, but with the investigation underway, she finally felt safe enough to come forward. It was heartbreaking to hear what she had gone through, and it only made me more determined to see justice done. HR didn't just rely on the testimonies either. They pulled Steve's emails, chat logs, and other communication records. It turns out he had left a long digital trail of incriminating evidence, more than I ever could have imagined. The printouts I had provided were validated, but there was so much more. Steve had been using the company's communication channels for years to send inappropriate messages, not just to me, but to multiple women in the office. And it wasn't just harassment. Some of his messages were outright disgusting, filled with explicit language and wildly inappropriate suggestions. Despite the overwhelming evidence, there was one thing that bothered me. Even though Steve was fired, he didn't exactly leave empty-handed. Word spread that he had received a pretty generous severance package as part of his termination. That stung. It felt like, after everything he had done, he was still being rewarded in some way. But as frustrating as that was, I had to remind myself of the bigger picture. Steve's career was effectively over. The industry we worked in wasn't huge, and news traveled fast. After the investigation, it became clear that Steve was now radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with him, and he was quickly blacklisted. In fact, not long after his termination, I did some casual digging online to see what he was up to. His public social media profiles painted a pretty sad picture. Steve had started listing himself as an independent consultant in our field, but based on what I saw, I seriously doubted anyone was actually hiring him. His LinkedIn page was barren, with no real updates or connections that indicated he was working. And on Facebook, he was heavily promoting a couple of MLMs, multi-level marketing schemes. To be honest, I felt a strange satisfaction knowing that Steve had been reduced to selling questionable products on the internet, most likely sinking his savings into a dead-end venture. It seemed like poetic justice in a way. As for Rob, things turned out well for him too. While I don't work with him anymore, we've stayed in touch. A few months after the whole Steve incident, I had the privilege of attending his wedding. He married a wonderful woman who couldn't be more perfect for him. Seeing him so happy, thriving both in his personal life and in his career, was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, good people can come out stronger on the other side. Rob might not have taken on Steve directly, but he made it through that tough time. And that was what mattered most. Looking back, the whole experience taught me a lot about power dynamics in the workplace and how people like Steve managed to get away with so much for so long. The truth is, these things don't happen in a vacuum. It takes a culture of silence, where people are too afraid or too tired to speak up, for someone like Steve to thrive. But once that silence is broken, once people start coming together and sharing their stories, the whole facade comes crashing down. Steve may have held on to his position of power for years, but in the end, the truth caught up with him. For me, it was a reminder that doing the right thing isn't always easy or quick. There were times when I felt frustrated, wondering if anything would actually come of my efforts. But in the end, persistence paid off. I couldn't save Rob from Steve's bullying in the moment, but by documenting everything and taking action, I helped make sure Steve couldn't hurt anyone else in our workplace. That was enough for me. I learned that sometimes it only takes one person to stand up and start the ball rolling. Once that happens, the momentum builds, and people who were once afraid to speak out find their voices. I wasn't the only one who helped take Steve down. It was a collective effort, but I like to think I played a part in making that happen. And that's something I'll always be proud of. In the days following Steve's firing, the office began to feel lighter. The tension that had been hanging in the air for so long had finally dissipated. People who had once been walking on eggshells were more relaxed. It was subtle, but noticeable. Conversations flowed more freely, and there was this collective sigh of relief, especially among the women in the office. While the details of why Steve was let go were kept relatively quiet, word spread through the grapevine that it had been due to multiple harassment complaints. It wasn't hard to piece things together, even for those who weren't directly involved. For me, the transition back to normalcy took a little longer. The whole ordeal had been draining, both emotionally and mentally. The stress of gathering evidence, constantly having to interact with Steve, and then going through the HR process had taken its toll. I hadn't realized just how much of a weight I'd been carrying until it was over. But slowly, I began to settle back into my routine, grateful to return to the work I loved, without the shadow of Steve looming over us. It wasn't long before I started hearing snippets from other departments about Steve's impact beyond just our team. Apparently, Steve's behavior had reached much further than we initially thought. Other women in different areas of the company had experienced similar harassment. But like in our team, no one had felt comfortable coming forward until they knew something was being done. After Steve's firing, more stories surfaced, some from women who had left the company long before, unable to endure the toxic environment he had helped create. I began to realize just how deep the problem went. Steve wasn't just a one-off bad actor. He was part of a larger issue within the company culture. The fact that he had been able to behave this way for so long, unchecked, said a lot about the systems in place, or rather, the lack of systems. It became clear that HR had dropped the ball on more than one occasion. They had turned a blind eye to warning signs and allowed a powerful figure like Steve to operate with impunity for years. That realization made me question a lot about the company's leadership. It wasn't just Steve who had failed us, but the people who had protected him. As much as HR had acted swiftly once they had undeniable evidence, it bothered me that they hadn't acted sooner. They had all the resources to investigate. They just hadn't used them until it was unavoidable. I started paying more attention to the dynamics in the workplace, noticing the subtle ways people in power protected each other, how certain behaviors were tolerated as long as it didn't ruffle too many feathers. In the months that followed, I considered moving on. As much as I loved the work and the majority of my colleagues, the knowledge that the company had let someone like Steve thrive for so long gnawed at me. I began quietly looking at other opportunities, exploring my options without fully committing to leaving. It wasn't that I was desperate to get out, but I felt the need to see what else was out there, in case I decided that this place wasn't for me anymore. Around this time, I had a candid conversation with my direct supervisor, someone I trusted deeply. She had been supportive through the whole Steve ordeal, though she hadn't been privy to all the details. I told her about my concerns, the unease I felt knowing how easily someone like Steve had been protected and how leadership had seemingly turned a blind eye for so long. To my surprise, she opened up about her own frustrations with the company's higher-ups. She too had seen things she didn't like, though she hadn't been in a position to speak out. We talked about how change, if it was going to happen, needed to come from the top. We agreed that while there were great people in the company, the leadership needed to be held accountable for fostering a better environment. It wasn't enough to fire Steve and move on as though nothing had happened. Structural changes were necessary to prevent someone like him from slipping through the cracks again. Those conversations, along with similar ones I had with other trusted colleagues, helped me realize that staying wasn't out of the question if I could be part of making things better. Slowly, a small group of us began advocating for changes, pushing for more transparency and better reporting mechanisms for misconduct. We started small, working through HR and management to implement workshops and training sessions on workplace conduct, not just for employees, but for supervisors as well. It wasn't a quick fix and the progress was slow, but it felt like we were chipping away at something bigger. In a way, what had started as a personal mission to take down one bad guy had evolved into a larger effort to change the system that had allowed him to flourish. It wasn't always easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way. But little by little, we were seeing the effects of our work. People started feeling more empowered to speak up, and HR began taking complaints more seriously, without waiting for a crisis to force their hand. Looking back now, I realized that the entire experience with Steve taught me so much more than I expected. It wasn't just about standing up to one person. It was about learning how to navigate the complexities of workplace dynamics, how to push for change from within, and how to stay resilient when things don't move as quickly as you'd like. While I still think about leaving from time to time, I'm proud of what we've accomplished so far. I'm proud of the way Rob bounced back, how our team rallied together, and how we turned a horrible situation into something that could drive lasting change. And most of all, I'm proud that I didn't stay silent when it mattered most. Thank you for watching.